Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video. Wishing you all good health and peace. The afternoon arrived cloaked in a heavy stillness, the kind that settled over the village like a mournful sigh. Tieu Nuong sat on the edge of her small mat, her hands trembling as she tied her faded blue shirt around her waist, its edges frayed from years of wear. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the faint tang of the river lingering in the distance, a quiet reminder of the life she built for herself after escaping her uncle's wrath. Her makeshift tent, perched at the edge of a quiet field, was a fragile shelter, its thatched roof sagging under the weight of last night's rain. The familiar sounds of the countryside surrounded her, the distant crowing of roosters, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the soft murmur of the river that ran like a silver thread through the village. She stepped outside, her bare feet sinking into the damp earth, and surveyed the small patch of land where she grew her vegetables, their leaves glistening with the remnants of the morning dew. Tieu Nuong bent down, her hands brushing against the cool, damp leaves of her greens, her fingers lingering on the rough texture of a kohlrabi. She had planted these with care, each seed a small act of hope, a promise of survival in a world that had offered her little kindness. She was an orphaned girl, cast out by the only family she'd ever known, her uncle, who had chased her from their home years ago, his words sharp as thorns, his eyes cold with misunderstanding. She had been a child then, too young to understand the weight of his accusations, too young to fight back. Now she was alone, her only companions the garden, the river, and the man who had recently entered her life, Mr. Chung. Mr. Chung was a steady presence, a man whose quiet kindness had lit up her days like a lantern in the dark. He was a carpenter from the next village, with hands roughened by wood and a smile that felt like a rare gift in her lonely world. They had met at the market one rainy afternoon, when he'd helped her carry her vegetables, his laughter a melody that had warmed her heart. Since then he had become a constant in her life, never demanding, always there with a kind word or a shared moment. He spoke of dreams, of building a better life, of crafting things that lasted. "I'll make you a proper roof one day," he'd said once, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "One that doesn't leak when it rains." Tieu Nuong had smiled, but inside, her heart had trembled. She wanted to believe in his words, in the future he painted with his quiet promises, but the scars of her past made her cautious, her hope a fragile thing, like a flower blooming in the shadow of a storm. She stood, her hands stained with dirt, her eyes fixed on the river in the distance. The flowers along its banks had been blooming for days, their petals a soft pink against the gray sky, but their beauty felt distant, a quiet reminder of the joy she could no longer reach. She thought of Mr. Chung, of the way his laughter had filled the silences in her life, of the warmth in his touch, the steadiness in his presence. "I wonder if he'll come looking for me," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the wind, her heart a tangle of longing and fear. She thought of her parents, of the mother whose voice had once been her lullaby, of the father whose hands had once lifted her onto his shoulders, their faces now a fading memory in the haze of her solitude. The sound of footsteps broke her thoughts. Tieu Nuong looked up, her heart skipping a beat. Two figures appeared at the edge of the field, their silhouettes stark against the gray sky. She recognized her uncle immediately, his hunched frame and weathered face a painful reminder of the past she tried to escape. Beside him was another man, Tien, a neighbor she vaguely remembered, his eyes sharp with a quiet intensity. "Nuong," her uncle called, his voice gruff but tinged with a forced warmth, his hands clasped together as if in apology. "Come here. I have something to tell you." Tieu Nuong felt her breath catch, her hands trembling as she brushed the dirt from her shirt. She stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes meeting her uncle's with a quiet wariness. "How do you know I'm here?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper, her heart a tangle of hope and fear. Her uncle smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes, its edges sharp with a hidden intent. "Don't worry," he said, his voice low, his hands gesturing to the ground. "I came to say sorry. I've thought about it carefully. I was wrong to send you away." Tieu Nuong felt her chest tighten, her hands clenching into fists, her heart a tangle of anger and longing. She remembered the day he'd cast her out, his words sharp as knives, his eyes cold with misunderstanding. He had thought she'd done something shameful, that her friendship with Mr. Chung was something to be ashamed of, and he had chased her from their home, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back. Now he stood before her, his voice soft with a false warmth, his hands outstretched as if to offer forgiveness. "I love you, Nuong," he said, his voice trembling with a practiced sincerity. "I have chickens and piglets. I want to give you some to raise. Consider it my apology. I hope you'll forget the past and forgive me." Tieu Nuong felt her breath catch, her heart swelling with a quiet longing, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She wanted to believe him, to believe that the family she'd lost could be hers again, that the years of solitude could be erased with a simple apology. But the scars of her past made her cautious, her hope a fragile thing, like a flower trembling in the wind. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion, her hands twisting the hem of her shirt. "I can't go back. I don't blame you, but I can't go back." Her uncle's eyes darkened, a quiet anger flickering in their depths, but he masked it with a smile, his voice soft with a false warmth. "At least come for a meal," he said, his hands gesturing to the path that led to his house. "After the meal, I'll give you the chickens and piglets. You can take them back here. It's just a meal, Nuong." Tieu Nuong hesitated, her heart a tangle of longing and fear, her eyes fixed on the river in the distance. She thought of her parents, of the meals they'd shared, of the warmth that had once filled her days. And she thought of her things, the small trinkets her mother had left her, the faded scarf her father had given her, the memory she'd left behind in her uncle's house. "I'll come for the meal," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, her heart a tangle of hope and dread. "But just for the meal." They walked in silence, the path winding through the village, past houses with thatched roofs and children playing in the dirt, their laughter a faint echo of the joy she once knew. The river ran alongside the path, its waters shimmering like a ribbon of silver, a quiet witness to her reluctant journey. At her uncle's house, the air was thick with the scent of cooking rice, the faint tang of fish sauce lingering in the air. Her aunt stood at the door, her face softened by a weary smile, her hands clasped together in a gesture of welcome. "Nuong," she said, her voice warm, her eyes bright with a forced joy. "I'm cooking dinner. I knew you'd come." Tieu Nuong nodded, her heart a tangle of longing and unease, her eyes scanning the small house for the things she'd left behind. She thought of the meal, of the warmth it might bring, of the chickens she'd take back to her tent, a small promise of a better life. But as they sat down to eat, her uncle's voice broke the silence, his words sharp as thorns, his eyes cold with a hidden intent. "Nuong," he said, his voice low, his hands clenched into fists. "There's something I need to tell you. I owe a man 50 million dong. I need you to help me pay it off." Tieu Nuong felt her breath catch, her heart sinking like a stone in her chest, her hands trembling as she set down her bowl. "What do you mean?" she asked softly, her voice trembling with fear, her eyes meeting his with a quiet dread. Her uncle's eyes darkened, a quiet anger flickering in their depths, his voice sharp with a desperate resolve. "You'll go to his house," he said, his hands gesturing to the door. "You'll work as a maid for 2 years. Your wages will pay off the debt. It's the only way, Nuong." Tieu Nuong felt her chest tighten, her hands clenching into fists, her heart a tangle of anger and betrayal. "You promised me chickens," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You said you were sorry. Why are you doing this?" Her uncle's eyes hardened, a quiet anger flickering in their depths, his voice sharp with a desperate resolve. "I raised you," he said, his hands slamming on the table, his eyes cold with a hidden intent. "I took care of you when no one else would. Now you owe me this. You'll go, Nuong, you have to." Before she could protest, a man appeared at the door, his frame tall and imposing, his eyes sharp with a quiet intensity. "Where's the girl?" he asked, his voice firm, his hands on his hips. Her uncle gestured to Tieu Nuong, his voice low, his eyes dark with resolve. "This is her," he said, his hands pushing her forward, his voice sharp with a desperate resolve. "She'll work for you 2 years as we agreed." Tieu Nuong felt her breath catch, her heart sinking like a stone in her chest, her hands trembling as she stepped back, her eyes meeting the man's with a quiet dread. The journey to the man's house was a blur, the path winding through the village, past the river that shimmered in the fading light, its waters a quiet witness to her reluctant journey. At the house, a woman stood at the door, her face hardened by years of toil, her eyes sharp with a quiet impatience. "You're the girl," she said, her voice firm, her hands on her hips. "From now on you're my maid. Your wages will pay off your uncle's debt. You'll do as I say, or you'll stay here longer." Tieu Nuong nodded, her heart a tangle of fear and resignation, her eyes fixed on the floor, the weight of her new reality pressing down on her like a stone. The days that followed were a blur of toil and hardship, each moment a quiet battle against the ache in her heart. The woman, her mistress, was harsh, her voice sharp with impatience, her hands quick to point out every mistake. "Wash the pot," she'd say, her voice firm, her eyes cold with judgment. "Cook the rice, don't let it burn." Tieu Nuong worked in silence, her hands trembling as she scrubbed the pots, her fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar gas stove, her heart a tangle of fear and longing. She thought of Mr. Chung, of the way he'd smiled at her, of the warmth in his touch, the steadiness in his presence. "I don't know if he'll come looking for me," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling with emotion, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The meals were the hardest, each one a quiet reminder of the life she'd lost. The mistress ate with her family, their voices mingling with the clink of bowls, while Tieu Nuong sat in the corner, her small portion of rice a bitter reminder of her place in the house. "Take it down there to eat," the mistress would say, her voice firm, her eyes cold with judgment. "You're an eyesore." Tieu Nuong nodded, her heart a tangle of shame and longing, her eyes fixed on the floor as she ate in silence, the taste of the rice bitter on her tongue. At night she slept on a thin mat in a small room, the air cold and heavy, the lack of a blanket a quiet reminder of her solitude. She thought of her parents, of the mother whose voice had once been her lullaby, of the father whose hands had once lifted her onto his shoulders, their faces now a fading memory in the haze of her solitude. She thought of Mr. Chung, of the life they might have together, of the dreams he'd spoken of in the quiet moments they'd shared. "Mom," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling with emotion, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Dad, Brother Chung, where are you?" Would Mr. Chung find her as she hoped, and pull her from the shadows of her new reality? Would Tieu Nuong find the strength to endure, to hold on to the fragile hope she'd carried through the years? Or would she be lost to the currents of her uncle's betrayal? The moonlight offered no answers, only its silent, silver glow, and the river whispered softly in the distance, a quiet witness to her longing. For now Tieu Nuong had the mat, the cold air, and the memory of a man who had brought light to her days, a small constellation of hope in the vast stormy sky of her life.